Delighted to get to this point in our day and be able to welcome and introduce Martin Berger to you. Martin is on the faculty at the University of California, Santa Cruz. He's actually spending a year in North Carolina through the generosity of the National Endowment for the Humanities. He's taken a sabbatical year. He's a professor in Santa Cruz in the Department of the History in Art and Visual Studies. His PhD, interestingly, and from Yale, well, it's interesting to me at any rate as an art historian, that his PhD is actually in American Studies. So his research and scholarship has focused quite a bit, not exclusively, but quite a bit on issues of race in American culture. He's the author of 3 award-winning books, Sight Unseen, Whiteness and American Visual Culture in 2005, Seeing Through Race, a reinterpretation of civil rights photography in 2011, and in 2013, Freedom Now, Forgotten Photographs of the Civil Rights Struggle, and it's the basis of that book from which our exhibition is. So he's both the author of the book and curator of the exhibition that we are presenting. And yet, very incredible intellect, distinguished mind. His publications go on for pages and pages, but just to give you a sampling of some of the other articles that he's written: Rosa Parks Fingerprinted, Montgomery, Alabama, 1956, Black Power, White Power, and the 1968 Olympic Protests, Overexposed, Whiteness and the Landscape Photography of Carlton Watkins, Negotiating Victorian Manhood, Thomas Aikens and the Rowing Works, and The Problem of Close Looking. Outside his distinguished scholarship, I found this interesting. He is also a board member of the Washington, D.C.-based Institute for Community Peace, which is a national organization that promotes violence prevention. So please help me to welcome Dr. Martin Berger.
That would have been a disaster. So thank you, Patricia, for that very generous introduction. I also wanted to thank Lisa Volpe for the very sensitive installation of my show, which was fantastic. And to mention also that it's a great honor to be speaking the same day as Dr. Vesey and Curator Haas. So it's a wonderful panel. I thank all of you too for coming. I know you've been sitting here a long time, and we'll get going here. So I want to tell you a little bit about the genesis of the show. In 2011, I published a book on what I called canonical civil rights photography. I basically tried to explain why it was that the photographs of civil rights that we're all familiar with look so similar. And I'll explain in a couple of minutes why I think they're similar. But at the end of the book, I said that if we want to properly understand both the 1960s and the civil rights movement, it was going to be necessary for us to reframe the famous images, that is, see them in new ways, and also add to the canon. I wanted to suggest that we needed to add new kinds of photographs to those famous images we've seen. And a friend of mine, who's also a museum director, he finished the book and he said, all well and interesting, but I don't really know what a reframing would mean, and I don't really know what a new canon would look like. And he said, almost as a challenge, if you can come up with a new canon and a reframing, I'll put on a show for you. So I researched it over the next couple of years, and in 2013, the show first opened at Santa Barbara, where I tried to present this new way of looking at civil rights. And I wasn't trying to make the claim at all that I had the answer to civil rights, but to suggest that we needed to add to our understanding by increasing the kinds of pictures we look at to expand the story. And I was making a call that we need lots more people to work at expanding the story. It's not a job for one man or one woman. A note on how I approached the material. I'm showing you almost a randomly selected New York Times front page cover, which was from the Birmingham protests began in April, but this is from May of 1963. You can see 3 photos on the front page representing Birmingham. May be hard to see. I'll show you details later. But the point is, I want you to understand that if you're familiar with art history and familiar with art, you know that close-looking, formal analysis is a really important part of what art historians do. And one of the things I tried to do in my book and the catalog that followed was to do close looking, yes, but to do it in context. So I'm not interested in looking at a photograph, or for that matter a painting, in isolation and doing a minute reading of all the precise elements that are there until I understand the political, the social context of the era. Because I want to know how period audiences looked. That's really important to me. I don't want to create readings that an academic might call presentist, meaning we're looking from our own personal vantage. For me to understand how these photographs functioned in the 1960s, it was essential for me to try and recreate, to the extent that I could, the mindset of black and white viewers in 1950s and 1960s America. So that was really key to my project. So let me tell you a little bit about why I think the canonical works kind of all look the same, and in some sense maybe even seem to be interchangeable. I'm going to cycle through a series of famous works and just talk about them briefly. On the far left-hand side, I'm showing you the very famous photograph of Elizabeth Eckford, one of the Little Rock Nine. She's one of the first students to integrate Little Rock High School. On the first day of school, when her and her 8 other black classmates showed up, because of a miscommunication, she got separated from the group. And she found herself walking up the front steps of the school alone, where she was barred by National Guard troops, and then confused and not knowing exactly what she should do at this point, she sort of retreated to the street. You see behind her the women, the girls who will become her classmates once the school is integrated, who are shouting horrible, hateful things at her, including "lynch the nigger," as Eckford is sort of looking for some safety. Behind her are National Guard troops. You can maybe see their helmets. They're doing nothing to protect her. All they're there to do is to prevent black students from actually entering the school. We see Eckford incredibly calm and composed, walking away with those contorted faces of the white schoolgirls behind her screaming angry things at her. On the right-hand side, one of the more famous images of the sit-ins, as we learned from Dr. Vesey, far from the earliest sit-in example, but many of the early sit-ins didn't have photographers, and so we know about them from oral histories, not from being documented by newspaper photographers. This one on the right-hand side from Jackson was particularly famous because a photographer was there and it circulated widely. But it followed a familiar pattern in many of the sit-ins where black students, and sometimes, as it was the case here in Jackson, an integrated group of students decided they simply wanted to sit at a lunch counter and to try and get service. Service was always refused. Sometimes they would shut down the counter, sometimes turn off the lights. What would often happen is that white youths would stream in and at some point begin to taunt the protesters, dump condiments on them, put cigarettes out on them, and as frequently happened, and happened in this case, they would eventually get pulled from the stools and beaten on the ground. Again, a very different protest, but in some sense similar to Eckford in that we see integrated black and white and actually Native American on the right-hand side students who are calm and composed as we see the kind of aftermath of the violence that's already been perpetrated on them. And we see here in the front some of the stuff that's been dumped on this young man who's sitting in the foreground. The famous Freedom Riders and one of the buses that got bombed outside of Anniston. This particular group of Freedom Riders was just an integrated group of young people who were trying to ride the bus from Washington, D.C. to Louisiana in this particular case. Their bus had its tires slashed at by KKK. Later, when the bus driver pulled off the road because the wheels deflated, a firebomb was thrown into the bus. The Klan held the doors shut to try and keep the Freedom Riders inside. Eventually, they managed to escape, and we see them kind of dazed outside the bus as the bus burns. In this case, we don't see the violent perpetrators, but we see the aftermath, and we see the Freedom Riders here milling around. Very famous image of Bloody Sunday in Selma, showing the long-time Representative John Lewis, at the time the president of SNCC, who's in his distinctive tan trench coat here in the foreground, who's being beaten by this state trooper here with a billy club that he has raised. And I can show you this, James Meredith in his March Against Fear, when he was simply going on a 200-mile trek to try and raise awareness about voting rights and to try and get more African Americans to register to vote. An unseen assailant in this photo fired 3 shotgun blasts at Meredith. 2 of them hit him, and we see him in pain on the road, sort of crawling quickly across the road to try and get away from the unseen assailant. Interestingly enough, this photograph on the right-hand side was the first photograph to win a Pulitzer Prize in photography that represented a civil rights theme. And what I think you can probably see from the images I've showed you, and from others you can likely conjure up in your mind, that there's a kind of dynamic that gets played out in all these images where African Americans are victims, whites are the perpetrators, and I would even argue that there's an understanding in white audiences' minds, and I'll clarify this more, that African Americans are essentially passive, that they're passive victims that are acted on by active, violent whites. This gets repeated again and again. And what's amazing about the repetition of this in the visual record is that virtually all of these scenes you see depicted here were scenes of black agency, scenes that led to changes in American society. In every case, we can see these photos representing a kind of victory for African Americans, and yet it looks like a defeat in each case. And why is that the case? Well, in the late 1950s and the early 1960s, the northern press that was printing these images tended to be slightly left of center. They tended to be supportive of moderate civil rights reforms. They wanted to see African Americans gaining more rights, but they tended to want things to go slowly. These images, it was understood by photographers and by reporters, were essentially safe images for liberal whites to look at. They didn't seem particularly threatening. One of the longest standing stereotypes of African Americans in American society, especially black males, is that they are violent, is that they are dangerous. To show African American males taking charge, looking powerful, is, one could argue to this day, something that can be frightening to white audiences. So reporters wanted change, but they wanted it to come at a pace that whites would be able to accept. So they consistently showed images of African Americans that made them look like victims, not like the victors. And I argued in my book that there was a kind of cost to this, because white sympathy was predicated on safe images where African Americans weren't taking power. What we needed in the 1950s and the 1960s, and what we need today, is a society where African Americans have equal access to resources, equal access to power, can make themselves into whatever they choose to do. White Americans in 1960s culture understood civil rights as incremental changes. We'll open up a lunch counter. We'll allow changing rooms to be desegregated. We'll allow people to swim in the same pool who are black or white. They didn't understand it as a significant rebalancing of power in the United States. That would have been too radical. And one of the reasons that I think we still have problems with civil rights issues in this country today is because that basic rethinking of how do we distribute power differently in this country is still not a conversation we've had. We're having continually incremental conversations, and that's a problem that remains to be addressed, but was certainly one that was particularly difficult in the 1960s. I want to just reiterate the point that I tried to mention before, is that I'm not at all claiming that African Americans are passive or are victims in these images. I'm making instead the very different claim that that's how they were interpreted by white audiences. Because I frequently lecture on this material, and I'll have someone in the audience say, I think those African American protesters are showing incredible strength, and I absolutely agree. To be willing, as protesters did here in Birmingham, to stand up to the force of high-pressure hoses that we know literally ripped clothing off of protesters, or be willing to have dogs charge you and not fight back, is something that takes an incredible amount of bravery. King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, who was responsible for the protests in Birmingham, knew that African Americans represented just 10-12% of the U.S. population at the time, that it wasn't going to be possible to change America through force, that African Americans needed allies. And King knew that by remaining nonviolent, by engaged in what he called nonviolent civil disobedience, that would be a greater route, a better route to getting sympathy from Northern whites. King was very savvy in his cultivation of newspaper reporters and especially photographers. He knew that photographs could make a difference in how white Americans thought about African American civil rights, and he knew that could eventually lead to meaningful change. So you see this image here. I'm going to read to you just a series of quotes that come from 7 different white news sources that are describing the protesters in Birmingham who are battered by these hoses. Newspapers reported on firemen's hoses, quote, flattening, sending protesters sprawling, spun head over heels, sitting passively, swept along the gutter like a stream of water, cut down like 10 pins, or flung into the air like sodden dolls. A white Birmingham native recalled of how the fire hoses sent, quote, black arms and legs jerking like those of puppets on a string, and bodies cartwheeling across the grass like scraps of paper caught in the wind. I'm not arguing that we can't see all of those as being accurate descriptions in some sense, but I am arguing that the consistent emphasis of whites on the fact that African Americans were being buffeted by events that they seemingly couldn't control was a conscious strategy on the part of white reporters and editors, again, to make things safe. You can get some sense of how Life magazine, which as I said was like other white periodicals, slightly left of center, still assumed that their audience was white and still assumed that they were creating stories from a white perspective by looking at the title of the story, They Fight a Fire That Won't Go Out. Now, on the one hand, blacks are credited as a kind of fire, and we can see that as strength. That's a good thing. But they fight a fire. It's self-evident that the they is the firemen. And visually, we're kind of aligned with the firemen as we're behind them on their side of this white-black divide there in Birmingham. Charles Moore, the white reporter who took this photograph, had free access to the streets of Birmingham on the day these protests were taking place. Imagine how different this photograph would be and how different the impression would have been on Life readers in 1963 had he been standing in the place of the protesters with the fire hoses aimed toward us. But that wasn't what happened. So I want to take you through some of the divisions of my show just to give you a sense of what I was trying to do and how I tried to do it. The show opens with a series called The Canon, where I was trying to engage in that reframing that I talked about before. I want people to continue looking at those famous canonical scenes, but I want them to begin to understand them in a new way. And that new way is usually to historicize them, to allow white audiences in particular to understand that black audiences were looking at the same scenes but with a very different set of glasses on and understanding them in a different way. So in general, white and black Americans were appalled by the use of dogs against peaceful protesters in Birmingham. That being said, after Life magazine published this article, there were many letters to the editor from whites who talked about African Americans. Clearly they were violent, and clearly this was the only way to handle them. Now, that may seem strange to us as modern audiences because the pages of Life show no violence on the part of African Americans. All the violence is perpetrated by the white police and by the white fire department. But white Americans at the time were so programmed to see African Americans as essentially violent that they kind of projected those pre-existing beliefs onto the people in these pages. Most whites, though, were sympathetic and thought that this was appalling. And virtually all blacks saw this as a terrible human rights violation. But blacks saw the scene in a particular way that had a lot to do with black history, which was invisible to most whites during the period. I'm going to read to you one letter written by a black writer to the Chicago Defender, which was a very prominent black newspaper in the 50s and 60s. And he wrote, quote, no, I got ahead of myself. Okay. I showed you this image for a particular reason. What I'm showing you here is I'm showing you African Americans under slavery who are being hunted down by dogs. And under slavery, dogs were frequently used both to capture escaped slaves, but they were also used basically just to terrorize blacks, to keep them in their place. We know from post-Reconstruction studies, one of which you mentioned, that dogs continued to be used during Reconstruction up through the 1890s and up through the 1940s as a tool of terror by Southern whites against African Americans. There were virtually no blacks in Birmingham, no blacks in the South, and few blacks in the United States that didn't see the use of police dogs as going directly back to slavery and directly back to this long-standing desire to keep African Americans in what was considered to be their proper place. So that was a very specific personal threat that black audiences understood. Now to my quote from the Chicago Defender. The Defender writer wrote, "Adolf Hitler let loose many evils in this world. Not the least among them were the snarling dogs trained to tear human flesh. With fiendish glee, the police and other constituted authorities in Birmingham, Alabama, have adopted this torturous method as a deterrent to black Americans. Other black observers refer to the use of dogs in Birmingham as Nazi-like brutality and Gestapo tactics." And I found one reference to someone talking about how the Birmingham campaign was reminiscent of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising in Poland that the Nazis put down. I found almost no references among white Americans to seeing the dogs being linked to Nazi Germany. And you have to remember, this is 20 years after the war, so this is very inflammatory language to use. I have found a few Jewish observers who noticed the link, but it was very common in the African American press to see Nazism raising its head here in the United States 20 years after the war. Now I'm going to read to you another quote. This is from James Baldwin in The Fire Next Time, a text that I'm sure is familiar to many of you, but I always recommend it to anyone who hasn't read it because it's fantastic to this day. And Baldwin writes, quote, "White people were and are astounded by the Holocaust in Germany, but I very much doubt whether black people were astounded, at least in the same way. I could not feel, but in those sorrowful years, that this human indifference, concerning which I knew so much already, would one day be my lot, on the day that the United States decided to murder its Negroes systematically instead of little by little and catch as catch can." I don't want to make the claim that what happened in Nazi Germany could have happened here. The important point is to understand that James Baldwin and many other black intellectuals were filtering it through that lens because it didn't seem implausible in the context of the history of American race relations. And to make it clear that that image at the top of the screen meant absolutely a totally different thing to black America than it did to white America in 1963. Another section of the show called Historical Precedents is just trying to drive the point home that we have an assumption that when news photographers go out and hit the streets that they're looking for news, they're looking for the best pictures, they're looking to capture whatever is happening at a particular moment. And I wanted audiences to understand that, yes, all of that stuff is true, but they are human beings who are kind of cultured in a certain visual world, who learn to see in a particular way, and look for what constitutes the right picture, having a lot to do with how they're taught about what's the right and what's the wrong picture. So I'm showing you an image that's incredibly famous. I'm sure virtually everybody's seen it before. It gets reproduced in textbooks all the time. It's showing a former slave who we know today only by the name of Gordon, who escaped from a plantation on which he was enslaved during the Civil War and met advancing Union troops near Baton Rouge in 1862. The photograph that was taken was made by abolitionists who wanted to circulate an image showing the terrible whipping scars across Gordon's back to raise money and sympathy for abolition in the North and also in Europe. The image is obviously one that tells a very particular story. It's certainly not a portrait. Portraits from the period would have shown the sitter fully clothed. They would have had props to indicate perhaps his profession. We would have had background information to give us some context about him. But Gordon is stripped to his waist. We see only a kind of hint of his face, and he's reduced down essentially to those vivid whipping scars across his back. When this photo was taken by abolitionists and when a woodcut print of it was published in Harper's Weekly, which was the Life magazine of 19th century America, There was very little information given about Gordon because the message was clear. It was a message that's very similar, I'm arguing, to those 1960s images of a black wounded body that whites have done bad things to. We do know that Gordon escaped from his Mississippi plantation by rubbing onions all over his body so that the tracking dogs wouldn't be able to find him. We know that he spent weeks crossing swamps and avoiding Confederate patrols. We know that as soon as he reached Union lines, he served as a scout for the Union Army so that they could be better informed about the terrain heading into the South. And we know that he continually volunteered for the Union Army, and once Lincoln allowed African Americans to fight, he quickly joined and enlisted. So this was a very brave, interesting, courageous guy, but that's not the story we get. And I want to argue that Gordon is the grandfather in some sense of Meredith, at least as far as visual representation goes. And reporters understood that this was the right shot to get. And once again, they're getting a very similar image roughly 100 years prior. I also have a section in the exhibition that's probably the one that I find most interesting, just called Doctored. And I want to make the point that the vast majority of images that were published during civil rights weren't doctored, but many were. And there were kind of looser standards in the 1960s about how you could or could not manipulate images. There were a lot of editors that made extensive changes to photographs to deliver the message that they considered to be the most important one. And this was a really great find when I was going through the files at the Library of Congress of a defunct New York newspaper that had donated all of their photographs to the Library of Congress. And what I found is, you can see above the boy's head, there's grease pencil marks from the editor who's letting his production people know the precise image that he wants to have reproduced. So below the boy's shin, there's a little kind of V, upside down V, and above his head, there's another V. And you can also probably see that the two men on the right-hand side who are standing there, that their torsos have been airbrushed out of the image. What the editor wanted with his grease pencil marks was to give an indication that this was the image that he wanted to appear in the paper. And what I'm showing you on the right-hand side is what did appear the next day. The image shows the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham in 1963. And this is not the bombing of the church, but these are people across the street who exited a restaurant to see the commotion that was going on. Now, the editors wanted an image that wouldn't be ambiguous, and they probably, this is conjecture here, but go with me, see if you believe me, they probably understood that the four standing figures would add some ambiguity to the scene. We look at their faces, we try and understand. Are they angry? Are they bitter? Are they concerned? What's going on? What we do know is that the image published greatly simplifies the scene. We have an African-American figure on his knees who's praying. He's not doing anything violent. He's not calling for action. He's doing something, again, that would make whites in the North sympathetic because there's nothing threatening here. But it's not a call to action in a way that African-American newspapers would have approved of during the period. So a very interesting manipulation. But I want to make the broader claim that even when photographers or editors are not manipulating images in the same way, that manipulation is just a part of producing photographs, that we all do that because we come with a certain perspective. I'm showing you an image here that shows the actual bombing of the 16th Street Church that was produced by Matt Herron, who's a white journalist who was affiliated with SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, a kind of grassroots, more radical civil rights organization in the 1960s. He came to the Baptist Street bombing a number of days after the victims had been taken away and the site had been cleared up. And his first thought was that the destruction wasn't as dramatic as he thought. The church had a big bombing and the human toll was undeniable, but the structure was a big imposing structure with a relatively small hole in it. And he thought, how can I communicate to audiences the horror of this? And he decided to climb into the front seat of a car that had been severely damaged in the explosion and to take his photograph in front of the steering wheel so that you could get a sense of a human perspective. There were no humans around, but he would give us a sense of the impact of the blast by showing us that shattered windshield. And Heron, who's still around, talks very directly about the fact that he wanted to create propaganda, but propaganda that was going to do good. He had a perspective, and he tried to get people to feel the way he felt about the scene. And he knew that to do that, he needed to create a more effective photograph than just taking a kind of uninteresting picture of a big hole in the wall. This is doctored too, in a sense. I'm not condemning it. I'm saying every picture is doctored to an extent. There's a difference between airbrushing and what Matt Heron did, but it's all on a kind of continuum of trying to win audiences over to your cause. In some ways, the most important section of my show is the one called Strength, because my biggest problem with the standard photographs of civil rights is that they show African Americans as victims, as I've said before. So I wanted to introduce images that would show the power of African Americans in the 50s and 60s to get people to look at civil rights in a new way. And I'm showing you here an image that was taken surreptitiously, which is one of the reasons it's not a good photo, but taken surreptitiously in a courtroom when the judge had barred photographs from being taken. And it shows Moses Wright on the witness stand in Sumner, Mississippi in 1955. Moses Wright was the great uncle of Emmett Till, who I'm sure virtually everyone has heard of. Till was abducted late at night from Moses Wright's home when he was on a visit from his native Chicago. And he was tortured in a nearby barn, eventually shot in the head, dumped in the nearby Tallahatchie River with a big piece of farm equipment tied with barbed wire to his neck. His mother, as is famously recalled, when the body was finally found, insisted on an open casket funeral, which was almost unprecedented at the time because the body was badly decomposed and damaged. But Mamie Bradley, the mother, said she wanted the world to see what they had done to her boy. Several weeks later, there was a trial in Mississippi of the two men who had taken Till that night. The trial, of course, ended in an acquittal from an all-white, all-male jury. There was no black in Mississippi and few in the United States who expected a different outcome. But what happened at that trial was Moses Wright, even though he knew there was no chance of a conviction, decided that he had an obligation to go into court and to testify. His testimony was electrifying, both to whites and blacks in Mississippi, because no one could recall a black man testifying against whites, particularly in a murder trial, that had ever been willing to take the stand in Mississippi. And we see Moses Wright at the moment when he's standing up in the witness stand and he's pointing to the two men that he saw taking away Emmett Till that night from his home. He soon thereafter had to relocate to Chicago. His life in Mississippi as he knew it was virtually over. But he did this because he wanted to show a commitment to the legal system. He wanted to follow through on his commitment to protect his great nephew, because he saw it as an obligation he needed to do. This photograph circulated widely in the black press during the period and was virtually unknown by white America. But black audiences cheered the bravery of Moses Wright and had a lot to do with implementing the civil rights movement, the beginning of civil rights. White America today is probably familiar with the battered image of Emmett Till's corpse, but that photograph today is a lot less interesting to me than this incredible brave act that Wright was able to undertake in Mississippi in 1955. Another image that I have in the strength section is one that might surprise you at first blush because it looks and is one of those canonical images. It looks like the kind of image we expect to see of an African American who's being simply brutalized again. And that's certainly how it was seen by the white press in the 1960s. The Communist Daily Worker, a newspaper that in the 60s was highly sympathetic to the black civil rights struggle, they described this photograph in the following way. It shows, quote, a grinning cop sicking his savage dog at the throat of a frail Negro. And another white periodical from the period refers to it as the thin, well-dressed boy seeming to be leaning into the dog, his arms limp at his side, calmly staring straight ahead as though to say, take me, here I am. So that is the standard reading, of course. And white newspapers, you need to know, during the period, they virtually never interviewed civil rights participants. They would talk to police, they would talk to whites who were protesting against the protesters, but they didn't talk to black protesters very much. When the image was published in Jet magazine, Jet did two things that were very different. First, it showed a close-up of the image, which occasionally did appear in the white press, but not always. But the second thing was that they actually talked to Walter Gadsden, who was the young boy's name. He was only 15 years old at the time, but he was quite tall, so most people assume that he's older. And they asked him about his life, and they asked him what was going on at the moment when this attack happened. And Gadsden explained that he came from a fairly conservative Southern black family that actually didn't approve of King and the protest movement in Birmingham. He didn't support the civil rights protests. He had gone downtown that day merely because he wanted to see what his protesting black classmates were up to. But suddenly, he was spun around by a policeman, and this dog was attacking him. What did Gadsden say about the attack? Well, he explained that he had grown up with large animals in his family, and that his father had taught him how to protect himself from attacks from big dogs. You can maybe see that Gadsden's left knee is raised kind of high for someone who's simply walking on the street. Gadsden told the reporter he was actually trying to knee the dog's jaw to break it so that it wouldn't be able to attack him. And what you can maybe also see is that his left hand is gripping the outstretched arm of the policeman. For anyone trained in nonviolent civil disobedience, you never grabbed the person who was attacking you. So in the white press, this was an image of this saintly, Christ-like figure who was a passive victim. In Jet magazine, this was an aggressive boy who wasn't going to take it and was fighting back against the dog. And that's exactly what Jet said is, he's doing the right thing. It's good to see this fighting back. And there were real debates that took place in the black community in the 50s and 60s about whether nonviolent civil disobedience was really the route to go. And there were many African Americans who said that we should be taking what they considered a more active stance. We should be actually fighting back. So to understand that the black community of the period, much like the white community, was not monolithic. There were a lot of different views going on. And this image is way more complicated than the traditional story that gets told about it. Showing you another image by that SNCC photographer, Matt Herron. And this is showing two men in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, who are filling out voter registration forms. They're basically trying to register to vote. Now, this is before the Voting Rights Act was passed, at a time when throughout the South it was exceedingly difficult for African Americans to gain the right to vote. You may know that in many states you had to pay a poll tax, essentially a tax, to be able to register. In many states there were literacy tests that were unequally applied to whites and blacks who were trying to register. In many states you had to get someone filling out a form that vouched for you as a good citizen, and that had to be done by someone who was already registered to vote, which meant effectively that a white person had to vouch for a black person for them to be able to have the right to vote. But probably the most effective strategy that was used during the period was the waiting period that's described on the sign above the men at the registrar's desk. Many southern localities made it a requirement that after you correctly filled out the forms, your name would be published in the newspapers for 2 consecutive weeks, white or black. So they argued it was fair. Everybody had the same treatment. But what was the purpose of that? The purpose of that was to let whites in the community know that some African American was trying to register. And at that point, you would lose your job, your family would lose your job. If you happened to have a store, you would lose your white customers. If you had a loan, your bank would recall your loan. And if that didn't work, there was often recourse to violence. So again, in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, there was an incredibly low percentage of blacks who actually had the right to vote. We see 2 men, middle-aged, but one on the left certainly older, who are attempting to register. Do they have an expectation that they'll actually be able to vote? It's doubtful during this period. But what they do have is a sense that they're citizens, that they have the right to be able to vote, and that, darn it, they're going to try and exercise that right. If they got the right to vote, who would they be able to vote for? white politicians who varied in shades of degree of their support for segregation. So it wasn't as if voting was going to be able to change the world at this stage, even if they got it. But again, the civil rights movement is filled with men whose names, and women, as we'll see, whose names are now lost to history, who made individual brave acts, most of which were never recorded by a camera, merely because they wanted to demonstrate the commitment to themselves, to their communities, and to whites about the importance of gaining civil rights in the United States. Another division of the show talks about women, because historians have known for years that the civil rights movement was driven by women. And yet the visual record makes it seem as if women played minor roles in the civil rights movement, which was absolutely not the case. This is a woman who was refusing to ride the bus in Montgomery during the Montgomery Bus Strike, which took place between December 1st, 1955, and December 20th, 1956. For more than a year, women, and it's estimated that 60 to 70% of the bus riders at the time were women, refused to ride the bus. So through the cold, through the rain, through the heat, they simply refused to get on to try and break the spine of the bus company so that they would finally allow to equal seating on the bus. A demand that seems so minor to us now, it's hard to imagine that the company was willing to risk bankruptcy and that the town could hardly stand the idea of people being able to sit side by side. The boycott was begun by the Women's Political Council. When we think of the Montgomery bus boycott today, I bet the vast majority of you think of a young Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. leading Montgomery in the beginning of modern civil rights. It's true King did a lot for the movement, but it never would have happened without women beginning the boycott, and it never would have succeeded without women deciding that they were going to stay the course and for more than a year stay off the buses. This photo is really interesting to me because it has a really, what a photo historian might say, a really low viewing angle. If you look at the image, you can tell that the photographer was very low down to the ground shooting up at this woman, and you can tell because we see so much of the underside of her box so that we know that we're kind of looking up at the underside. The photographer makes her look kind of monumental, makes her look like an important figure, and she is an important figure, but she's not a person whose name we know. She's not making her political statement by carrying a sign. She's not arguing for equal rights in any overt way, but she makes her politics abundantly clear just by the fact that she's carrying that heavy box and those bags and her purse, and she's walking. In Montgomery in the 1950s, black women were overwhelmingly employed as what were called domestics in white households. It's more than likely that she worked all day long in a white household, she'd gone shopping after work, and now she was taking all the groceries home to take care of her family. So incredibly political, but silent at the same time. And it's kind of, it's a monumental sculpture in some way, and I think a very fitting monument to the women of Montgomery. This is an image that was on the cover of the catalog I showed you, and it was one that I kind of agonized about having on the cover of the catalog. The publicity people at the press really wanted it because they said, it's different, it'll grab people's attention, it's kind of exciting. But I was worried about it because one of the arguments of my show is that you need to understand the images in context. I originally wrote 500 words for each of the photographs in the show, which is a museum professional will tell you is absolutely impossible. You can't do that. And Lisa Volpe sensitively cut them down, but they're still really long for a museum. But I wanted people to see them in context. These are not images that speak for themselves. They're images where you have to understand the political, social context of the time. So this image circulating on its own worried me, and I'll explain a little bit more in a minute. You need to understand this image was not shown in the mainstream press at all. In the South, Southern white papers tried to avoid civil rights stories as much as they could. As we heard from Dr. Vesey earlier, blacks tended to appear in the paper only for murder crime stories. Some newspapers would have a Negro page on Sundays where they would talk about community events, but African Americans got very limited coverage. In the North, this image wasn't published. Why? Because those slightly left of center liberal editors understood that it wasn't going to do useful political work. Because this woman was resisting arrest. She was looking violent. She appears to be biting the elbow of that police officer. And that they knew this photo wasn't going to advance the civil rights struggle. But the same photo, interestingly enough, was published in Jet magazine again, or a close variation of the photo that you can see in the show. And Jet magazine talked about it as basically, here's a woman who's not going to take it. This was also from the Birmingham protests in May of '63. This woman was ordered to be taken under arrest. She refused. 3 officers grabbed her, as you can see on the left. It eventually took 5 officers to rein her in and to take her into custody. Jet magazine talked about it as an image that showed how these so-called men weren't really men because look how they were treating a lady. And they also said that it argued about the strength of black women who weren't going to accept the kind of treatment they were getting in Birmingham. Interestingly enough, the image was also published in a very conservative, pro-segregation pamphlet that used almost the same image to talk about how African American women aren't civilized. They're not proper women. They don't deserve the right to vote. Look how they act. They're animalistic. We shouldn't give them the right. So, ignored in the southern mainstream press, ignored in the northern mainstream press, black press seizes on it in one way, pro-segregationist white press seizes on it in a totally different way. Hopefully I'm making the argument clear about why it's so dangerous just to look at images and to talk about how we feel or what's going on in them. We need to understand them in their context. And that brings me back to why I worried about putting this on the cover, because if people weren't politically predisposed to look at it in a sympathetic way, I was nervous that it would just reinforce their pre-existing views of African American women. So photos, images, they're really dangerous, they're really powerful things, and they mean nothing outside of a context. The final thing I want to just leave you with is, some of you may know that Rosa Parks was actually the 3rd woman to refuse to give up her seat in Montgomery on a public bus in 1955. But the first 2 were judged by the NAACP to be women that had personal issues in their background that would make them unsympathetic in a court. Parks was the ideal person to go forward with because she seemed so proper, she was so middle class, she was so well put together. There was nothing that they could use to impeach her character. She was simply someone who wouldn't give up her seat on the bus. Parks, again, was the safe example of a black woman not obeying the law. The anonymous woman on the left-hand side seemed too dangerous, again, to the liberal press to be used. And as a consequence, we got a more simplistic, more flat story of what civil rights was actually about. Okay, thank you very much.